She stepped into his path without warning. No eye contact. No hesitation. Just the quiet precision of a woman who had already decided what she was willing to lose. Marisol Adiz pressed close to his shoulder, close enough that her words wouldn't carry, and the club's amber light caught the tension along her jaw. "Don't go inside." That was it. 3 words. Then she was gone, moving back down the corridor before Rafael Augustin could form a single question. His hand was already reaching for the lounge door. His fingers stopped an inch from the handle. The hallway smelled of cedar and warm leather, and the chandelier above the entrance threw gold light across marble floors like everything in the world was exactly the way it should be. It wasn't. Hi viewers, have you ever had a gut feeling so strong it stopped you cold, even when everything around you looked perfectly fine? Drop your experience in the comments right now. Rafael Augustin had walked into rooms where men were deciding to have other men killed. He had sat at tables where silence was the most dangerous language spoken. He was not a man who stopped for anything. But something in the way Marisol moved, the steadiness of it, the total absence of fear in her eyes, reached into his chest and grabbed something he couldn't name. He stood still in that hallway for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds. That's all it was. He turned from the door. Walked east instead, toward the staff-only door at the end of the corridor. His footsteps were measured and quiet. The kind of walk that gives absolutely nothing away. He pushed the door open and stepped into the security office. Every monitor covering the main lounge was dark, all 12 screens. Every camera angle. Every corner of the room where his top captains were right now drinking and laughing and waiting, completely, deliberately offline. They were not supposed to be offline. Rafael stood in that doorway and felt something move through him. Not fear. Colder than fear. The specific chill of a man who realizes he was about to walk into something that had been built specifically around him, and the only reason he didn't was because a woman with nothing to gain whispered 3 words in a hallway and then walked away without asking for a single thing in return. The question tightening in his chest right now wasn't what was behind that lounge door. It was how long someone had been planning for him to open it. The gun would have been easier. Marco Deschamps set a manila folder on the desk and stepped back. He didn't say anything. His collar was dark with sweat and his hands weren't steady, and in 7 years of working for Rafael Augustin, Marco had never once looked like that. The fact that he looked like that right now told Rafael more than the folder did before he even opened it. He opened it. 41 wire transfers. Each one routed through a shell company registered in Queens, Valles and Moreno Development LLC. The individual amounts looked routine. 40,000 here. 62,000 there. The kind of numbers that move through construction accounts every week without drawing a second look from anyone, but the dates were surgical. Every single transfer had been executed on evenings when Rafael was documented as traveling. Chicago. Miami. Geneva. Not random dates pulled from a calendar, his known itinerary. Cross-referenced, matched, and used as a clock. Someone had studied his schedule the way a hunter studies a trail, quietly, over months, with total patience, and had moved money only in the windows when his eyes were away from the books. Then the meeting logs point 17 private gatherings inside the main lounge. Each one coded in the internal calendar as member-reserved event. The names listed as present matched no membership records. The camera coverage for every one of those 17 evenings, offline. Same pattern. Same deliberate blind spot, created and used and then closed without a trace. Marco set a second item on the desk. A whiskey glass in a clear evidence bag. The liquid inside was darker than it should have been. A sample had gone to a private lab contact 40 minutes ago. The result was already back, 2 compounds, both individually legal, that combined to produce a state of extreme and documentable cognitive impairment lasting roughly 40 minutes. Inside the main lounge, sitting on the table where Rafael would have taken his seat, there was a financial authorization form. Preloaded with his signature block. Witnessed. Dated tonight. Waiting for one hand to finish what had taken 2 years to build. He would not have died in that room. He would have signed his empire away inside it. Rafael closed the folder. Set it flat on the desk. He looked at the date the transfers started. He didn't need to search for it. It came to him the way certain dates always do, the ones attached to decisions that can't be taken back. The transfers had started the same week he removed Corrado's son from the organization. This was not about money. He understood that now with a clarity that felt like cold water moving through his entire body. Someone hadn't gotten greedy. Someone had gotten hurt, and hurt, left alone long enough, builds the kind of patience that money never can. Dario Velez was 26 years old and had never once believed the rules were built for him. That was the whole problem. Not his youth. Not his confidence. Just that specific kind of certainty that grows in young men who are raised close to power without ever having to build a single inch of it themselves. He had his father's name. His father's connections. Not one drop of his father's patience. The night it all fell apart was supposed to be straightforward. A transfer on the Gowanus waterfront, product, not weapons. Dario had the route, the contact, and clear instructions that had been given to him twice in the same meeting, which should have told him exactly how thin the margin for error was. He improvised anyway, changed the route on instinct. Brought in a second contact who hadn't been vetted, a man he trusted because of a feeling rather than a record. The handoff completed. But the two unvetted eyes that witnessed it were connected, 3 steps out, to a rival faction working out of Brooklyn. Within 10 days, 2 of Rafael's most protected supply lines had been quietly mapped by people who were never supposed to know they existed. The damage was recoverable. Barely. And only because Rafael moved before the information did. He called Corrado Velez into his office the following morning. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. He didn't raise his voice once. He laid out, with the kind of precision that is its own form of cold, that Dario would be removed from operational work, placed in a quiet role inside one of the legitimate holdings, and compensated fairly. Not punishment, Rafael said. Reassignment. Corrado sat across from him and nodded. Said he understood. Said the decision made sense. His face held the specific composure of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where showing the wrong emotion cost people their lives. He went home. Sat in his kitchen until almost 3 in the morning. Didn't speak. Didn't eat. Just Saturday, and somewhere in those hours, something shifted inside him. Not loudly. The way a bone cracks under sustained pressure, no sudden break, just a slow, quiet change that only becomes visible later when the whole structure gives. He started keeping notes the following week. Small things. Internal schedules. Itinerary patterns. Financial routing codes he had full legitimate access to. Nothing that would raise a single flag if someone opened his desk drawer. Just documentation, quiet, careful, building week by week like sediment settling at the bottom of still water. Invisible until it isn't. He kept smiling at the right moments. Kept arriving on time. Kept performing every function expected of him with the kind of steady reliability that makes a man invisible to suspicion. 2 years. Not one crack. Not one moment where Rafael Augustin read anything on that face but loyalty. And right now, inside the main lounge of that club, Corrado's captains were raising glasses, because tonight was the night 2 years of patience was finally supposed to pay off. 3 years before that night, a woman sat alone in a Staten Island hospital waiting room doing math that refused to work out in her favor. Kezia Adiz had been running the same numbers for 6 straight weeks. Her father, Tobias, 61 years old, dialysis 3 times a week, had lost his insurance coverage when the flooring company he worked for restructured and cut benefits for part-time employees. The bills that started arriving in the mail had stopped looking like bills weeks ago. Now they looked like a countdown. 17,000. Then 23. Then a letter from billing explaining that continued treatment required a payment arrangement or a guarantor, and that without one, the facility would need to explore alternative care options. Her sister Marisol was picking up weekend shifts at 2 different restaurants and still coming up short. Between the two of them, they could cover rent and groceries and the minimum payment on a medical credit account that was growing 4 times faster than they could touch it. Then one morning, the hospital billing department received a wire transfer. Full balance. Cleared. A private medical trust established in Tobias Adiz's name, providing complete ongoing coverage with no expiration. No application filed. No guarantor named. No explanation attached to the payment. Just the problem, gone. from a direction nobody could trace. Marisol found out 6 months later. A hospital administrator said more than she should have during a routine phone call, one name, mentioned once, carefully, and Marisol had carried it forward from that day like something she couldn't put down and didn't want to. Not exactly gratitude. Something heavier than that. The knowledge that someone had looked at a crisis she was fighting alone and reached in without being asked and without expecting anything back. She started at the club 8 weeks ago through a staffing agency. By week 3 she understood the rhythms of the room, who sat where, who talked freely near the waitstaff because they had learned to treat service workers like furniture, and what certain kinds of conversations sounded like when the men having them thought no one was listening. Tonight she had been clearing glasses from a foretop near the north wall when the word started landing tonight. 3 times in under 2 minutes done. Once. Followed by the kind of laugh that only comes from a man who has been holding tension for a very long time and is finally letting it go. She set her tray down on the service counter. Walked into the corridor. Found him before he reached the door. 3 words. Then she walked away. Because she didn't need him to say anything. She just needed him to stop moving forward. What those men had planned for Rafael Augustin wasn't death. Death would have been direct. What they had built for him inside that room was a cage made entirely out of his own signature, and once he walked in and picked up that pen, there was no lawyer alive who could open the door from the outside. 7 o'clock the next morning, Rafael Augustin was already sitting at the head of the table before anyone else arrived, the private dining room. No outside windows. Mahogany walls and acoustic tile behind them. He had chosen this room for business 100 times before. He chose it again now for a completely different reason. It was a room where nothing said inside it traveled anywhere else. The captains came in 1s and 2s. Each one carrying the loose, easy manner of men who believed last night had gone exactly as planned. Coffee in hand or nothing at all, settling into their usual seats with the low, comfortable noise of people who are comfortable. Jabari Osei arrived second and took the chair to Raphael's left. Lemuel Cross came in with his jacket already off. They talked about something small near the door. Nobody noticed what was missing from the room yet. Corrado Velez came last, grey suit. Even face. He took his seat without looking directly at Raphael, set his hands flat on the table, and fixed his gaze somewhere in the middle of the room the way a man does when he is being very deliberate about not looking at anything specific. Raphael let the room settle completely. Then he spoke. No preamble. No elevated tone. He used the same voice a man uses to report the weather. The accounts associated with Valles and Moreno development had been frozen as of 6 that morning. All access credentials for the club's internal security systems had been revoked overnight and reassigned. 3 financial channels linked to the Queen's shell entity were closed permanently. The individuals who participated in the 17 undocumented member events would receive separate communications by end of week past tense. Every word of it. Done. Finished. Already handled before anyone in that room had poured their first cup of coffee. He named no one. He made no accusation. He extended no invitation to respond. The room understood exactly what was happening. That was the entire point. Power that has to announce itself is still working to prove something. Rafael Augustin had nothing left to prove inside these 4 walls. He was simply informing the room of what had already occurred, the way you'd tell someone a door had been locked. Not a discussion. Not a warning. A fact. He watched Corrado through the full recitation. Hands flat the entire time. Breathing steady. The composed expression that had held through 30 years of difficult rooms, holding now too. When Raphael finished he asked, without inflection, if there were any questions, and not one person spoke. He nodded once and stood. That was the meeting. The captains filed out with the careful, recalibrated movements of men rearranging their understanding of the morning in real time. 3 of them didn't look at Corrado as they passed. One touched his shoulder, not solidarity. Something closer to a man pressing his hand to a wall to check how much weight it can still hold. Corrado stayed seated. Hand still flat. He looked at the center of the table for a long moment, then the corner of his mouth moved. Not relief. Not defiance. Something quieter and far more difficult to read. the expression of a man who had waited 2 years for a specific moment, had finally arrived inside it, and discovered that it felt nothing like he had imagined it would. He stood without being asked. Walked to the door. Paused with one hand on the frame. He didn't look back. But in the doorway, low and steady, he said 4 words. "You still don't know." Then he walked out, and the silence he left behind was the loudest thing in that room. Rafael Augustin did not go home that night. He sat in his office on the 43rd floor with every light off except the single lamp on the corner of his desk, and the city below ran its usual noise, sirens, horns, the low grind of a place that never fully shuts down, and he heard none of it. He was too deep inside his own head. He was not thinking about Corrado, he understood now. The motive was clear, the mechanics were mapped, and the response had been executed by 6 that morning. That chapter was handled. What was keeping Rafael awake in that dark office, still in his suit jacket at 2 in the morning, was a question with no clean answer. What had he missed? Not in the numbers. Not in the transfers or the shell company or the meeting logs. He had sharp people around him, and those things had eventually surfaced. What he was pulling apart right now was something harder to examine. Something closer to home. Corrado Valles had worked inside his operation for 31 years. Rafael had been at the man's first wife's funeral. Had sent flowers when his daughter got married. Had trusted him with the kind of operational knowledge that, in the wrong hands, could dismantle in 6 months what had taken 2 decades to build, and for 2 full years, the man had smiled across tables and nodded in meetings and performed every function of loyalty while quietly preparing to bring the whole structure down. Not one signal. Not one off moment. Not one morning where Rafael had looked at Corrado and felt anything other than the steady confidence that comes from a relationship you stopped examining because you thought you already knew everything about it. That was the real wound. He had stopped checking. Not on the money, he checked the money constantly. He had stopped checking on the people. The temperature of the relationships. Whether the men around him felt seen, felt respected, felt like partners in something rather than parts in a machine. Loyalty is not a permanent condition. He understood that now with a coldness that sat in the center of his chest and didn't move. Loyalty is a temperature. And temperatures shift quietly, over time, in rooms where no one is paying attention to anything except the bottom line. He began going through the other captains in his mind. Not their performances. Their resentments. What had each one lost under his leadership that had never been acknowledged? What had each one given that had never been returned with anything more than a paycheck? The list was longer than he wanted it to be, and if Corrado had nursed a wound for 2 full years without a single crack showing on the surface, the question that was keeping Rafael in that chair, in the dark, at 2 in the morning, was unavoidable. How many others were sitting in their own kitchens right now, in the quiet, keeping their own notes? By Thursday, Rafael Augustin had a plan. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. It was the kind of plan that only works if nobody knows it's happening. He drafted a financial memorandum. False, every number in it invented, every routing detail fabricated, but constructed to look exactly like the kind of proprietary intelligence that would be worth something to someone who was building a case against him or positioning themselves to move against him. The document described a new cash flow channel being opened through a property acquisition in Atlantic City. Specific figures. Specific intermediary names. Specific timeline. He created 5 versions, each one carried a single, small internal difference, a routing number altered in the 3rd paragraph, a different intermediary name in the 5th section, a shifted acquisition date in the closing lines. Enough variation that if any version surfaced anywhere it shouldn't, Rafael would know exactly which copy had moved and exactly whose hands it had passed through. He placed each version inside a stack of legitimate documents and handed them to 5 different captains in the context of 5 separate routine briefings. Casual. Unremarkable. The kind of thing that gets filed and forgotten. Then he waited. Jabori Ose got version 2. Lemuel Cross got version 4. 3 other captains received the remaining copies. Rafael told no one what he'd done. Not Marco. Not anyone. 72 hours passed. 3 versions generated no movement at all. Clean. Those 3 captains went about their week without a single external contact Rafael's team couldn't account for. Version 4 produced a phone call. Lemuel Cross, from his personal cell, to a number associated with a competing faction out of the Bronx. The call lasted for minutes. Rafael logged it. Filed it. Did not move on it yet, for minutes could mean many things, and he needed to know what kind of problem he was dealing with before he decided how to handle it. Then version 2 came back, the not to a federal office. Not to a rival crew. Jabari Osei had placed a call to a civil attorney, a specialist in offshore trust structures and asset protection. A lawyer people hire not when they want to attack someone, but when they're afraid of losing something they've already accumulated and they want it somewhere safe before anything happens. Jabari wasn't feeding anyone. Jabari was scared. He was protecting himself. Moving money quietly to somewhere it couldn't be touched, which meant he believed, without being told, that something was about to collapse around him. That was a completely different problem than betrayal. And in some ways, it was more important information, because a man who is scared and moving quietly is a man who knows more than he's been officially told, which meant someone was talking to Jabari outside of official channels, and Rafael had not yet found out who. The federal picture was already further along than anyone had told Rafael. Marco Dishon laid it out on a Tuesday evening in the same staff-only office where the dark monitors had told the first part of this story. He didn't use notes. He had memorized what he needed to say because he didn't want any of it written down in a room with walls the Southern District had been building quietly for 14 months. What they had wasn't one source. It was layered, multiple contributors, each feeding small pieces over an extended stretch of time, none of it individually enough to move on, all of it assembling into a structure that a skilled federal prosecutor could start connecting into something that held weight. One source had provided transaction patterns, not the specifics of individual transfers, but the rhythm of them. The timing. The seasonal patterns that would help an investigator know where to look and when. A second source had provided meeting schedules. Not the content of meetings, just who was in the room, on which dates, and which locations had been used for gatherings that weren't on any official calendar. A third had given up 2 names. Protected intermediaries. Low level, technically, but connected to enough of the broader structure that placing them on a map gave federal investigators 2 fixed points to build outward from. No single one of those contributions was enough to indict anyone. Together, they were enough to fund 3 more years of investigation and keep a dedicated task force fully justified in the eyes of a federal judge. Rafael sat with that for a long moment. This was not the work of one traitor who had been caught and removed. This was the result of a culture, not organized opposition, nothing with a name or a meeting or a coordinator. Just a collection of individual, quiet decisions made by men who were afraid and had each, separately, concluded that the safest thing they could do with the information they carried was move a piece of it somewhere that might protect them if everything came down. Nobody had organized this. That was the part that was hardest to sit with. It had organized itself, the way fear always does, one person at a time, in private, without announcement or coordination, each person believing they were acting alone. Rafael had built his operation around the principle of compartmentalization. His captains knew what they needed to know and nothing beyond it. He had always believed that protected him, limited exposure, limited liability, limited vulnerability. What he hadn't accounted for was what compartmentalization does to people over time. It isolates them. And isolated men, carrying weight they can't discuss and stakes they can't share, eventually make decisions that prioritize their own survival above everything else. The real threat wasn't the evidence the federal investigators had managed to collect. It was the conditions inside his own organization that had made 14 months of quiet cooperation possible. He hadn't been undermined by enemies. He had been quietly abandoned by men who no longer felt connected to anything larger than their own fear, and that truth landed harder than anything else had in a very long time. He started with the simplest thing he had stopped doing years ago. He listened. Over the following 3 weeks, Rafael Augustin met individually with each remaining captain. Not in the club. Not in any room associated with business or authority. He chose restaurants in neighborhoods none of them usually worked in. The backs of cars. A park bench on a Wednesday morning with coffee from a cart and no agenda written down anywhere. He didn't interrogate. He didn't test. He asked, about families, about frustrations, about what each man thought could be done differently if he were the one making the calls. He asked the kind of questions that only mean something when the person asking them actually intends to hear the answer. Kwame Asante told him, carefully but without flinching, that decisions were regularly made in rooms where the people most affected by them weren't present and weren't consulted afterward. He said it the way a man says something he has been holding for a long time and is relieved to finally set down. Darius Fennick said he hadn't felt like a partner in the organization for several years. More like a contractor who was well paid and well managed but never actually trusted with the full picture. He said it quietly, without anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. Rafael heard each of them. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain the reasoning behind decisions or reframe the history. He sat with what they said and he let it be true. That was the hardest part. Not hearing it. Letting it be true without immediately constructing a response. He also handled Marisol. The private medical trust covering her father Tobias was restructured and made permanent, independent of the club, independent of any organizational changes, protected by its own legal framework so that nothing that happened in the future could touch it. No conditions attached. No future obligations implied or expected. When Marco told Marisol, she said thank you. Then she asked if she was still on the schedule for the weekend. She was. And that answer told Rafael something that none of his captain's conversations had. Some people don't perform their character. They just live it, quietly, and let the action speak without asking anyone to notice. Not everything from those 3 weeks was clean. 2 captains resigned with arrangements that suited everyone. 1 was removed without ceremony. The process was slow and uncomfortable and at several points genuinely painful in the way that necessary things often are. Then on the last day of the 3rd week, Marco passed him a message. Corrado Velez was requesting 1 private conversation. His words exactly, 1 last meeting, no lawyers, no conditions. Just 2 men in a room. Rafael looked at the message for a long time, then he said yes. They met in a diner in Flushing that neither man had any connection to. Fluorescent lights. Laminate tabletops. Coffee that had been sitting since early morning. The most ordinary room Rafael Augustin had been inside in years. No mahogany, no marble, no chandelier throwing gold light across anything. Just 2 men in a booth near the window with the city moving past them like nothing in the world was unusual. Corrado looked smaller. Not in his body, his posture was the same, his hands were steady. Smaller in the way a man looks when he has finally put down something heavy that he has been carrying for so long he forgot it wasn't supposed to be part of him. He didn't open with justification. He looked at Rafael and said, I need you to know I understood what I was doing the entire time. I'm not going to tell you I lost my mind or that it got away from me. I knew. Every step. Rafael said nothing. It wasn't the money, Corrado continued. You already know that. It was Dario. And I understood your decision. In my head I understood it completely. You were right. What he did was reckless and it cost the organization, and you responded the only way that made sense. He paused. But a man doesn't always live in his head. And somewhere between understanding something and accepting it, I made a turn I couldn't come back from. Rafael picked up his coffee. Set it back down without drinking. 31 years, Corrado said. And in the end I was willing to trade all of it for a feeling. A feeling, Rafael. Not money. Not power. Just the feeling that something had been taken from my family and I needed to take something back. He looked at the table. That tells me something about myself I've spent the last 2 months trying not to look at directly. The diner ran its quiet noise around them. Someone laughed at the counter. A bus moved past the window. Rafael had prepared words for this conversation. He did not use them. He said, you leave. Completely and permanently. No contact, not direct, not through anyone else, not in 5 years, not ever. Your pension holds. It will continue exactly as agreed. Your family is not touched. That is the end of this. Corrado received that. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has accepted something that he knew was coming and has already finished grieving it. He stood. Buttoned his jacket. Extended his hand across the table. Rafael looked at it for a moment, 2 full seconds, maybe 3. Then he took it, not from forgiveness. Forgiveness was a longer road than this diner and this morning. He took it because the chapter needed to close completely, and a man who leaves a door partially open has not actually closed anything. Corrado walked out. The bell above the diner door rang once. Then he was gone into the street. Rafael stayed in the booth. He finished his coffee. He looked out the window at ordinary people moving through an ordinary Tuesday morning, buying coffee, walking fast, talking on phones, living lives that had nothing to do with any of this, and he sat with a truth that had taken 2 years of quiet betrayal, 1 whispered warning in a hallway, and 31 years of relationship to fully surface. Power does not fall because of enemies. Enemies are visible. Enemies can be mapped and countered and removed. Power falls because the people closest to it stop feeling like they matter to anything beyond their function. Loyalty does not disappear in a single dramatic moment. It drains away slowly, in the silence between what people feel and what they believe they are allowed to say. The strongest position a man can hold is not the one that makes betrayal impossible to attempt. It is the one that makes betrayal unnecessary to consider. Rafael Augustin left the diner and stepped into the Tuesday morning. He had work to do. Not the kind that shows up in ledgers or on security monitors. The quieter kind. The kind that has to be done one honest conversation at a time. He started walking, and if you've made it to the end of this story, then you already understand something that most people only learn the hard way. Real power is not about control. It is about connection. And the moment a leader stops investing in the people around them, the countdown begins, whether they know it or not. If this story made you think, made you feel something, or reminded you of someone in your life who chose loyalty when it cost them, drop that in the comments. Your words might be exactly what someone else reading this needed to hear today. Share this story with someone who needs it. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories about power, loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet decisions that change everything. Stories that inspire, challenge, and stay with you long after they end. Do not miss what is coming next.